Welcome to our discussion on Equal Pay Day. My name is Karin Lips, and I am the president of the Network of Enlightened Women, known as NEW. NEW educates, equips, and empowers young women to be leaders. I am delighted to have joining with me today Romina Boccia from the Heritage Foundation. Welcome. We're excited to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. I want to go ahead and read Romina's bio, and then we will jump into some discussion questions. Romina is a leading fiscal and economic expert at the Heritage Foundation. Her research is focused on securing economic freedom, controlling the size and scope of government, expanding opportunity and flexibility for workers, reforming Social Security, and simplifying retirement savings. Romina regularly advises members of Congress and has testified before House and Senate congressional committees, as well as before state legislatures. She is widely published and often appears as a guest expert on television and talk radio. She received her bachelor's and master's degrees in economics from George Mason University. And we here at NEW especially appreciate that Romina goes out to some of our campuses to speak on a variety of campuses, or a variety of topics. Her most recent event was at Catholic University on the same topic that we are talking about today, the wage gap and equal pay. A key aspect of NEW is that we create a vibrant community for young women, both in person and online. So as we begin this discussion, please feel free to leave comments and questions for us now, or feel free to email those later to us, and we are happy to continue the conversation. So let's jump right in. Today, March 31st, has been proclaimed Equal Pay Day, or the day that supposedly marks how much longer into the next year women have to work to make the same amount as men did the previous year. So Romina, could you talk to us about where did this holiday come from, who made it up, and how did March 31st become the day?
Yeah. So March 31st is really a random day. It is not even reflective of the actual pay gap. This is a day that the National Committee on Pay Equity has designated to highlight what they perceive as a gender wage gap. And the same way that, say, those of us in tax and spending world might highlight how long into the year Americans have to work until we reach Tax Freedom Day, where the rest of the year you're working for yourself and to feed your family and provide for your community. This is a way to highlight this day. I do, however, think that this is it's a bogus day because it means very little. And I think it's highly misleading. Just before I came on to talk with you, Karin, I was looking at a CNN story that had the headline of "Today is Equal Pay Day and it's no day to celebrate." Now, that article made the argument because it's unfair that women have to work so much longer to make the same as men, which is not true. But I would say it's not a day to celebrate because it's completely made up and it victimizes women instead of celebrating them and empowering them. And that's why I think it's actually a very harmful day. And I want to take this opportunity to clear up some of those misconceptions about what's really going on with women in the workplace.
Oh, thank you. So the day is based on this idea that women supposedly make approximately 20% less than men just because they are women. So it's a 20%, you can think of it almost as a 20% tax in the workforce just for being a woman. Could you define where did they get the number, the 20% number that we see used? And I think I saw that same CNN article where they cite the Census Bureau data, but then use it to advocate for Equal Pay Day. Yeah. So where does the number come from, and how do you interpret the statistics that they use?
Yeah, I think this is really a misinterpretation of statistics, and in some ways it's a misunderstanding of what the number actually tells us and what it doesn't tell us. Now, anybody who wants to verify this number for themselves, the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out on an annual basis the median hourly earnings of full-time wage and salaried workers, and then separates the numbers by sex, race, and a number of other factors. And so that's where that number comes
Romina,
from.
can you say that again? Because I think that's really important, that what that number is actually measuring for people, because I think that is so key.
Maybe I could say it in a simpler way. What it basically does, it looks at all of the weekly earnings of all of the men and women in the economy. And then that gives you a distribution between high and low earners. And then it takes that person in the middle of that earnings distribution, that's called the median. And it looks at the woman in the middle and the man in the middle, and then divides the woman's earnings by the men's earnings. And that gives you the so-called wage gap, which as of 2019 is 81%.
Thank you.
But it doesn't really tell us much of anything except that in the earnings distribution, the woman in the middle makes 81% of what the man in the middle makes, but doesn't tell us anything about what jobs they have, what education they have, like what does that distribution look like? That's really the question we need to ask, because what determines what people get paid? And the way that the left tries to take this number and convince women that they're victimized is by saying that, see, women don't get paid the same as men for doing the same work. And that is absolutely not what this number tells us. It tells us nothing about that.
Well, and this is where progressive feminists get the number where they say things like women make 79 cents, what it used to be. Now, with more recent data, 81 cents for every dollar a man makes. So I think it's important for our viewers to see that this is where this number comes from. But as you point out, there's a number of factors that aren't taken into account. So one of the factors I know you and I have both written on is hours worked, right? That on average, men work more hours than women in the economy. What are some other factors that are not taken into account in this statistic that you've written about?
Yeah, I think hours worked is actually a really big one. And then it's also how women and men tend to work those hours. That's another big one that you can discern from the data. And that comes to the point of flexibility. What do people value in the workplace, and how do we choose our jobs in the industries we work in? What's important to us really plays into not just the hours we work in totality, like how many, but also how we work those hours. So let me explain a little bit. If you look at all full-time workers, women on average tend to work 10% fewer hours than men. But that's not the whole story. Women also tend to value, especially working moms, tend to value flexibility a great deal. When I say a great deal, 70% of working moms, according to a Pew survey, said that flexibility was the most important factor for them. So as women start having children, their priorities start shifting. And as much as they want to stay attached to the workforce, they're more likely to want to have more flexible arrangements where they can work from home, maybe a couple days a week, work different hours, something that allows them to fit their work within their other life priorities, including raising their families. So that's a big deal. And that's not something that we can capture very easily with data. But one way of capturing is that what industries men and women tend to choose. And we find that women tend to choose industries that offer more generous compensation in the form of benefits, including paid leave, including better health benefits. If you're thinking about wanting to provide for your family, that is very important to you. And that can be more important to women than the cash wages portion that they take home. And this is something else this data does not consider. The 81 cents on the dollar statistic only looks at your take-home pay, the cash wages you take home, but we need to consider total compensation. How much of your compensation do you receive in the form of benefits versus cash? And women are more likely to work in industries where they get more benefits. Like, for example, teachers, they may not have a very high salary, making $50,000, $60,000 a year in cash wages, but they get very generous health benefits. They get very generous time off benefits. They might get a pension when they retire. All of that needs to be taken into consideration.
Having that summer off, that's a big benefit, but that doesn't, right? Like, that's not measured in this data anywhere. And I don't think there's any place in this data where they're taking into account, when people are actually working or where they're actually working from when you talk about flexibility, right?
That's right. But there is a researcher at Harvard, Claudia Golden, who's done really great research on this. And what she has found is that certain industries put a premium on you being able to be on the clock whenever you're needed, putting in those billable hours, being able to travel and do make a lot of sacrifices for your work. That tends to be especially the case for lawyers and CEOs and other C-suite jobs. And then if you look at a role like a pharmacist, for example, that allows for much more flexibility. You see pretty much no wage gap among pharmacists because that is an industry where you get paid based on the hour, regardless of when you work those hours or how many hours you work. Whereas a lawyer receives a wage premium for, say, working 80 hours. You get a lot more per hour being willing to put in those extra hours than if you're only able to work 40 hours, say, your average work week. And so all of those things factor in. And we do see a difference, though. Young women, especially unmarried, college-educated women in urban areas, so in the cities where the more vibrant, dynamic jobs are, actually tend to make more than their male counterparts. It's only when women get to the point in their lives where their families become more important, where they start having children, that we see the statistical wage gap, which then we can explain by looking at some of those factors for how women choose to work, when they choose to work, how much they choose to work.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the choices that men and women make, and you've talked a lot about some of the choices women make. I think it's also interesting to think through some of the choices men make, especially in terms of maximizing earnings. So one thing I read years ago is that at one point, those on the left were pushing for comparable worth, this idea that the government would decide what jobs were comparable, that were maybe heavily dominated by men or women in different industries, and then say that those were paid the same. But part of the challenge there is, well, what about the high risks in some jobs? So maybe you need the same level of education for two jobs, but the level of risk of injury or death is much higher in some areas, specifically like coal miners, for example, right? That is an industry dominated by men, and they're compensated more there. Can you talk more about the choices men make sometimes to maximize earnings?
Yeah, and it starts even before college. I saw a very interesting survey that was trying to get at the question, why is it that men, at least in the past, were more likely to choose STEM fields and women would go into, say, education or communications roles, more liberal arts? And what was identified in part, it was that when you asked women and men for how they chose their majors, what they factored into their decision making, for men, by far the most important factor was considering the status that they would receive working in that industry and how much pay they would get. And that makes sense if you think about how couples form. What do women look for in a man? A lot of women still look for that provider, that breadwinner, maybe with an eye towards wanting to start a family. And that hasn't really changed, even though roughly 40% of households now have a woman as the primary breadwinner. So we are seeing a shift in our society. And for women, it was more like, what jobs did they think they would enjoy doing? And if you think about that, it means really that women have much more freedom to choose what makes them happy and it's on a societal level much more accepted. We still expect men to make more money, to have high-powered jobs, and many women strive to do the same, but others don't. And we see some of those differences in the data. And then when it comes to risk, because of that preference of status and a willingness also to take on more risk that in part is biological. I mean, men don't carry children. They're the ones that had to provide in the past. Now we live in a modern society where we can split those responsibilities differently, but men tend to be more risk-taking in general based on those attributes. And so what we find, for example, is that in industries like construction, resource extraction, you mentioned coal mining, the risk of suffering from a workplace fatality or injury is much, much greater, to the degree that if you look at workplace fatalities among the civilian population, so you're excluding the military, you find that 93% of all workplace fatalities occur to men. That's just incredible.
93%. Wow. That's a big number. Yeah. Very
right. And you have to pay them more. You have to pay them a risk premium for doing those kinds of jobs, which is, you see this today in our economy with the coronavirus pandemic, where even grocery stores are having to pay the cashiers, the people restocking the shelves, more. I know Walmart and Aldi have announced they're increasing pay by $2 per hour because they realize that in this current situation, these workers are taking more of a risk. They're the frontline employees. They make sure that there's food on the shelves. And during those circumstances, you do see a risk premium in pay.
Well, many of our viewers are college students. I know you mentioned STEM a little bit. Can you talk about how college major influences earnings? I think it's interesting that, for example, women's studies is a major that's dominated by women. And if you look up the data on how much women's studies majors make, it's a lot less than, say, some of the engineering majors. But we want, or at least I want, people to be able to have a choice to pick their major. I just think they then have to understand how that influences their earnings later on after college. What do you think about how college majors influences earnings?
It is a big factor because it determines the industries that will be available to you, the jobs that will be available to you, people who have greater tool set of technical skills, who are willing to tackle more difficult subjects like math, engineering, economics, finance. Because those subjects are more difficult, they tend to be paid more highly, because in the end it comes down to supply and demand. And how many women's studies experts do we need in our economy versus how many people do we need that are architects, that are engineering the next technology, that are building the next Google or Facebook? That innovation is really where the big returns are. So it's really a luxury in our society to be able to choose a degree where it's unclear how that degree is going to pay off in the future. And that's something that I think students should be aware of. And I think a lot of the subsidies we are pouring into the higher education system allows distortions like this to happen, where we might get too many women's studies majors, and the ones that end up in the academy that get a nice job in an ivory tower university, they're going to be fine. They're going to make a decent amount of money, but others may find themselves disappointed by an economy that doesn't maybe need those skills and values other skills more highly. But that's okay, because we now live in a period where we all have to engage in lifelong learning. So even if somebody made a choice on a major that perhaps wasn't the best choice in hindsight, there are other ways now today with virtual learning and apps and so forth for people to develop new skills that meet a market demand. And I think that's really good news, and that wasn't always the case.
Those are wise words for our students who may be watching and maybe regretting their choice of major, or maybe thinking about their job prospects in this economy. Now, I want to ask one more question, and then I want to open it up to questions from our viewers. So you have a piece out this week headlined "Feminists Equal Pay Day Compares Apples and Oranges." And you mention a study in that piece of the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority. Could you describe that? Because I think that is fascinating.
Yeah, it sort of serves as a control study, if you will, because sometimes it's difficult if you're looking at the whole economy. How do we know when we're actually comparing apples and apples, meaning men and women doing the exact same work? Are they getting paid the same? And so this is one of those studies that allows us to really do that, because what you have is bus and train providers that work for the Massachusetts Transit Authority. It's a completely unionized labor force. It doesn't matter what your sex is, whether you're a man or a woman. You get paid on based on excuse me, your tenure. I got a little Marco Rubio moment here.
No,
you get paid based on tenure, meaning how long you've been working for them, and then how many hours you're working. And especially if you're working overtime hours, that's where you get most of your pay. And what they found is, looking at men and women in that environment, that controlled environment, there was still an 11% pay gap. Women made 89 cents of what the men made. And the way that they were able to explain that is that women were more likely to take unpaid leave. So they would take more time off. And the other factor was
that flexibility point, right?
Yeah, and they were right, and they weren't willing to work those overtime hours in many cases. And so I think it was like 80% of overtime hours were worked by men, and so that made up the difference. And there's another really interesting study looking at a more modern transportation network, if you will, which is with Uber drivers. That again, you have an example where the algorithm doesn't discriminate. You get paid based on the number of rides you take, how long the rides are, and what hours you're working. And what they found among Uber drivers, again, women got paid less than men. And the reasons for it were that they tended to have lower tenure, meaning they didn't work as long for Uber. It was more of an in and out for women, versus men would do it more as a full-time job at times. And then they weren't willing to drive some of the higher risk hours, like Saturday nights. And maybe that makes sense. Maybe you don't want to be shuttling around drunk people in your car by yourself. But that was one of the more lucrative times to be driving. And so that explained some of the differences. One other factor that was kind of interesting in this study with Uber was that drivers that drove a little faster were able to pick up more rides, and women were less likely to drive faster. They would drive more slowly, again, demonstrating that preference for risk mitigation.
That's interesting. Well, thank you. I want to turn now to some questions from our viewers that are being sent to me. So here is one. How do you rationalize with the liberal feminists in media who won't accept the statistic and still want to portray women as the victim? How is this narrative harmful to women and society as a whole?
I think we need to recognize some of the motivating factors behind what's going on here. So to some degree, I have debated folks on the left that use the statistic to claim that women are being discriminated against in our society. And even when you get to the point where you show them that number actually doesn't tell us that, then they'll quickly shift to, yeah, but it's not fair that women tend to do more of the domestic chores, that they are more likely to take care of children. And then they start questioning those social and cultural choices that we make and say, those aren't really choices. Women are being pushed in that direction. And what they're really trying to get at is, we want equality in the sense of equality of outcomes, where even if women want to choose to do it differently, they call it leveling the playing field, but it's really stacking the deck against what would be the otherwise natural outcome. So one example, for example, in Sweden, they have very generous paid leave provisions. And what they found is that women were more likely to take leave and for longer. So it ended up harming their promotion prospects and their earnings over time. So what did they do? The government then demanded that men also needed to take leave when their family was having a child whether the men wanted to or not. And they made the woman's leave contingent on the men also taking leave. So they were really trying to socially engineer here an outcome where they were like, well, if the woman has to stay home, it's going to affect her promotion and earnings prospects. Let's force the men to stay home too, and then we'll all be even. And that's just, I find that extremely concerning. And the other point you made about the comparative worth regime, that's another thing that the left is pushing. And during the Obama administration, they actually passed, Obama signed an executive order that required firms to report wages based on sex and race and some other protected factors. And countries that have adopted that, like Iceland and Denmark, what has happened is that their governments are really trying to meddle with how businesses compensate their employees, doing it under the guise of reducing discrimination. But it's not so much about discrimination, because that's not what's driving it. But what they've done is basically they're trying to equalize wages regardless of how many hours people work and the kind of work that they're doing. And what that results in is basically kind of like our federal government workforce, where you have some people working really hard and others are not. And it generally creates low morale when you see that no matter how hard you work, you can't get ahead, because everyone gets paid the same based on a rigid pay scale, and you're not actually compensating people for performance and for their contributions. And it brings down productivity and lowers morale, and creates a general level of unhappiness and lower output. So it makes our economy weaker. But it's really about that. It's about manipulating the natural outcomes from the choices that people make by imposing via the government an outcome, a preferred outcome for some people, under the guise of equality. It's like mini socialism in the labor force. But I think that to the extent that we're telling women that they're victims, that no matter how hard they work, they're going to be discriminated against, that they won't get paid as much as a man just for being a woman, I think it really, for me personally, before I learned what's really going on, I found that to be very discouraging. Like, why work hard? Why go for that harder major? Why put in those extra hours to try and earn a promotion if you feel like no matter how hard you work, you can't get ahead? So that's why, for me, it's really important to talk to young women about this, so that they know that that's not true. That in America, we get paid based on the value we contribute to the economy, the value we provide for our employers, that it absolutely makes sense to get that extra education, to identify a market need and meet it, to be entrepreneurial and strategic, and to negotiate for your pay and promotion. It really matters, and that's how you get ahead. And don't let anybody tell you that just because you're a woman, you're being held back. It's not true. The only thing holding you back is yourself.
Well, I agree with you, Romina, that the equal pay day message, it's not an empowering message for women. It doesn't give women tools or empower them to make the choices that are best for them or their families. I think I would imagine that's something that motivates both of us to write and talk about this topic a lot. I want to turn to one last question. So someone wrote in and asked that they have seen tweets of the liberal media trying to use the coronavirus pandemic as a mandate for action surrounding equal pay. Can you talk about that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have seen that as well. And we're seeing the left, under the leadership of Pelosi, try to get their radical progressive agenda through during this crisis. We saw this during the CARES Act package, with all sorts of unrelated policies being tagged on the equal pay discussion. We already have laws that protect women and minorities and others from discrimination. We've had an equal pay law on the books since 1963. So we already have a law for that. What they're really pushing for are things like the Paycheck Fairness Act, which is also highly misleading. It would basically empower trial lawyers to go after employers based on flawed statistics, not actually having to demonstrate evidence of discrimination, which is what the case is today. And that's hard to do when there is very little of that in our economy, thank goodness. And if you think about it, it's not in the interest of businesses or employers to make bad decisions about who to hire and how much to pay them based on factors like your race or sex. That ultimately is going to hurt that business if they're selecting someone based on their skin color, or if they're a man or a woman, rather than based on their skills and what value they will bring to that firm. That's what's driving those decisions. And businesses that are discriminating, they get punished by the market. But now is not the time to use what is a real public health crisis that has already put millions of Americans out of work, that has shuttered entire industries and states as we're trying to contain the spread of this novel virus that has the potential to kill millions of Americans. This is not the time to push a radical leftist agenda that is built on a misunderstanding of what's really going on. I think that's really damaging and harmful. And I try to make that case in my piece, that both men and women are best served by a strong economy that offers us opportunities to realize our full potential, to serve one another in the marketplace, using our skills and abilities and aptitudes. And we're facing a crisis as a nation right now, and we should be coming together to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. That should be our sole and primary focus, to allow us to open the economy back up, to get Americans back to work, both men and women. And because a strong economy helps all of us, and that's also the best protection for anybody who thinks they're being discriminated against at their work, at their job, for whatever reason. The best security you have is if there's another job you can get, if we have a strong economy that allows you to leave a bad employer that doesn't value you for the contributions you make. And it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, that can happen to anybody. And so that's, I think, what we should be focused on now. And we should call out the left for trying to leverage a crisis, really abuse what is a serious public health crisis to push through their agenda. I think it's despicable.
Well, thank you, Romina, for joining us today. Our viewers can find your piece over at the Daily Signal on Equal Pay Day, and I'd encourage them to check that out. And just want to say thank you again for joining us. It's been a delight to have you on to talk about this important topic today. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
You too.